Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. One of the things that I've thought about quite a few times, but I haven't really articulated my thoughts on properly, is the fact that we need to have conviction without necessarily being certain in life. And I've always found this an interesting problem that we come up against. In fact, it speaks to something quite deep, but maybe I'll get onto that more later. Why is it even a question in the first place? Well, the idea is that when it comes to what we know and why, right, epistemology, how do we know what we know? It does really transpire that in many cases we don't know with an absolute mathematical certainty, right? Indeed, outside of the realms of mathematics, it's very rare. So it's one thing to say that 2 + 2 = 4, or that 5 × 5 is 25. But when it comes to things like, is it going to rain tomorrow? What is the age of the Grand Canyon? What years were the Romans operational for? What's the best thing to have in my tea? Well, indeed, what's the best diet to have? That's a big one. What is the... what should I do with my life? Eh? What's the best belief system in the world? All of these things have open edges, I suppose you could say. There's always a degree of doubt that you can throw into any one of those questions. Something as simple as, is it going to rain tomorrow? I mean, if you just have a cursory glance at physics and all the possible interactions between all of the molecules and the particles in the atmosphere, the changing temperatures and that kind of things, are all things that converge together to have an effect on that question. And so they are left without really any I've got to be careful about how I phrase this, because what you can easily do with that problem is you can say, well, because some things have an element of doubt in them, therefore there is no real distinction between what's true and what's not. That's not the direction you want to go in. But you have to admit, as a matter of intellectual humility, that we don't really have certainty in very many of our beliefs. Actually, that's usually pretty rare. And one of the things that I think allows us to cultivate wisdom is simply knowing where those limitations are. That's a big part of it. A really foolish man thinks that he knows more than he does, and indeed thinks he knows more than he can. I think that's a big factor. So if we're being sensible and we know a little bit about knowledge, then we know that there are definitely limits that we hit in pretty much every avenue of life. What's another? I want to really hammer that home, because there are things that we can regard as certain, but even then you could wedge in an element of doubt. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you are a very, very robust scientist and you run 1,000 experiments on the same phenomena. Let's, for example, say you're studying copper, right? And you're trying to find out whether copper conducts electricity. Now, we would conclude pretty much that it does. That's just like a basic property of copper as a material. So what you do as a scientist to figure that out is you say, get copper, you put it under the same conditions consistently 1,000 times, and you put electricity into it 1,000 times, and then you test, well, does the electricity conduct through copper or doesn't it? And after 1,000 times, under the same conditions, you find, oh, yeah, it does. We've got a consistent pattern here. So can we be certain that copper conducts electricity? Well, technically not. That's an interesting twist, right? Technically, you can just be very, very confident. But we don't know absolutely for sure whether the 1,001st time that we run that experiment, something foreseen might have happened. Maybe there's something that we didn't factor in. Maybe something about the laws of electromagnetism change, or not change, but maybe they throw in a twist that we didn't expect during the 1,001st time that we run the experiment. And therefore we don't actually have copper that conducts electricity. That is actually, we have to admit that as a possibility when we're humbled in the face of nature and complexity. So even then, we have something with many things in life that seem that they could be certain, but in fact, really, when we examine them, don't have to be, not really. So there's an element of doubt in many things. And of course, that just becomes increased when we're talking about things like historical facts, right? How many Roman soldiers were there in the Roman army? That's way less concrete than something like a consistent scientific experiment. What food should I have? How many calories do I need as a human being? These are all things which are way more vague. So when we go through life, we have to lack certainty. We have to accept that we can't be certain about many, many, many things, and indeed many important things as well, that we even choose to live our life by. And I suppose this is the point that I'm getting to with the whole reflection, because nevertheless, we have to live, right? We have to make decisions and we have to progress through life. And I always found that interesting because I think I made the mistake, call it like an element of autism or something, where I'm overanalyzing things. But I always had this sense that really what you want to do is you want to know the truth and you want to know it with certainty so that you can live life accordingly. But that seems to be, the more you study it, the more that seems to be off the table. So what does that leave us with then? Because you might say, I'm not going to have conviction in something until I know for certain that it's true, right? And I suppose we do that to a degree sensibly in most areas of our life, right? Someone says to you, I think you should move to a different part of the world so that you can get a new job. And you might say, yeah, but I'm not going to do that unless I have some idea that job actually exists, right? So you are indeed, I think we all require some level of truth before we lay our cards down or place our bets in terms of having conviction in what we're going to do, right? You wouldn't pack an umbrella unless you actually thought it was true that either it is raining or at least there's a high chance that it's going to rain. So our understanding of the truth does affect how much conviction we have. Yeah, we don't have certainty. So should we just withhold our conviction? I suppose that's the balance, right? That's what I'm thinking about. Now, it reminded me of a quote by Bertrand Russell. I'll be frank, I don't like Bertrand Russell very much. He's smart, but there's something sly about him in his work, and I don't think he was a very moral person either. And he once said, someone once asked him, would you die for your beliefs? And he said, no, I wouldn't ever die for my beliefs because I could be wrong. And I used to think that was a fairly intelligent reply. But then you think about it. Let's say you're in a crisis. Let's say you're in a battle of some kind. Would you want that guy by your side? Would you want him to fight with you? Would you want him to say, if you're a woman, would you want him to be the father of your children? Right? Will you die for our children? I don't know. I could be wrong about how much I love them. Yeah. Will you stand next to me in a battle? I don't know. I could be wrong about how loyal I am to you. I could be wrong about how much I care about this stuff. Think about how useless a society of that kind of man would be. How unreliable, and how loose, I suppose, that man's activities and convictions are going to be. So really, the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about the stakes of life and what we have to deal with and the challenges we're faced with, the more I found his position to be actually quite contemptible. Yeah, they're intellectual, they're grounded to some degree, right? As we've admitted, there's uncertainty in life. But then he's taking that uncertainty as an excuse for not really fully dedicating yourself to anything. And I suppose that's the problem, right? Because it's a question of dedication. Because full dedication to something true and important, let's just say important, is almost like a sacrifice of one's life, right? I will give my life to pursue this thing. I will give my life to value it. Bertrand Russell isn't prepared to do that, apparently, because he could be wrong. So if we're not going to take that approach, what's the rationale? I've thought for quite some time as the rationale is that your knowledge and your certainty only takes you so far. And then it's an act of will, and really it's an act of faith to push your conviction to that extra step. To live life as if you really, really care about it, even if you're not completely sure about it. To give the things in life your all, even if your intellect doesn't fully grasp them. And I suppose that's all I'm really saying. I find it interesting, for example, when you get into arguments with people about religion, as an example, and you're going through religion, you come up with, like, say, more and more and more convincing arguments that your position is true, whether it's a Catholicism versus Protestantism, or even just Christianity as a whole compared to, say, like Islam or Buddhism, or even atheism, right? Or religion versus atheism. And maybe you're pushing those arguments through and saying, well, okay, but this argument gives us a bit more conviction, and this argument gives us a bit more, and this argument gives us yet more conviction that this position will be true, right? And then someone might revert and say, oh, yeah, but at the end of the day, isn't truth complicated? Couldn't we all be wrong about what we're trying to believe? And it's like, yeah, but you don't live that way. I mean, if you're a Christian, if you're a Catholic arguing with a Protestant, for example, and you might say, doesn't it look like Catholicism might be true? And they'll say, yeah, but at the end of the day, truth is complicated. And you think, well, it wasn't so complicated, apparently, that you're still willing to give your life to Christianity as opposed to Islam, right? For an atheist who might, for example, read every scientific study they come across, let's say they read a scientific study that tells them to eat 10 eggs a day and only milk. Now, they might say, well, yeah, maybe there are arguments, but isn't life complicated? And you think, well, it wasn't apparently so complicated that you weren't willing to accept the scientific studies you were given, despite the fact there's loads of uncertainty in those. So when we see the fact that we have to live life when the rubber meets the road, yeah, we lack complete certainty, but nevertheless we have to proceed with conviction. And I think the real question then, I mention all of this because it changes the question about what epistemology is really for. Because I think if you approach epistemology, how do we know what we know? A lot of people approach it with this idea of reducing uncertainty completely, right? Their idea is, how do we find certain knowledge? How can we be absolutely sure about things we need to know? And that became pretty clear. It became pretty clear to me pretty quickly in my education that that's a dead end, because it's in a very small number of cases that you can actually do that. Now, don't get me wrong, there are important certainties that we can discover. In fact, profoundly important certainties we can discover in life. But when it comes to our approach to knowledge as a whole, again, it throws a bit of a curveball in, right? So what's the question instead then? If the question is, how do we become certain about everything we need to know? The question really, I think, should be, at what point is the certainty enough for us to choose to act in light of it? And I don't know whether there's a completely formulaic approach to that question. I don't know if there's a single equation you can give for that. I think it's different for each person. It's also not only different for each person, but it's different for each situation. Because sometimes you don't have time to think and you don't have time to dissect. Sometimes you do. So for example, if you have 50 years to study the nature of particles, for example, in a nice, well-calibrated laboratory, then you can go and study the nature of particles. But if you're being chased by a lion through a forest where you can't see where you're going and you have to make the decision, do I turn left or do I turn right? Well, how much time have you got to run that experiment, right? You've got loads of uncertainty in that situation. Nevertheless, you need conviction. Because if you hesitate in that situation and you don't choose to go either left or right and you stay still, boom, you get eaten by a lion. So no matter what, whether we like it or not, life compels us to have conviction. And it's our level of certainty in that sense is a secondary concern. Now, I say that as someone who is deeply committed to the questions of truth and epistemology. But I had to consider that as a kind of a really preliminary reflection, because it shows us that there is an intimate connection between our knowledge and our actions, or what we know in life and what we need to do. And indeed, I'm going to do a lot more thorough work on that exact question in the future. I've been thinking about this particular topic for quite some time. But, okay, so life impels us to act. Perhaps we then conclude that questions of certainty are a secondary concern. Does that mean they're unimportant? Not even slightly. Questions of certainty, or how certain we can be, are very important. So if they're so important, where does that leave us? And I think where it leaves us is that it encourages us to push the scale of certainty as far along as we can, so that we can make our decisions with more courage and more understanding. So if we have the option of being, say, 10% certain about something, or 90%, then the 90% is the better bet, for sure. And all of our philosophical thinking, all of our critical thinking, all of our epistemology, indeed all of our science should be geared towards doing that, right? Increasing the amount of certainty we can have in any given moment, whilst recognizing that 90% is probably a better, a more reasonable goal than 100%. And in most cases, 100% will just not be achievable. So that's what we should do, so that we can be more convinced. You know, it would be a foolish thing to just completely navigate life on the whim of chance, right? As if you just flip a coin every moment and say, well, I need to have conviction anyway. I can't be certain, so let's just treat everything as if all truth is equal. Let's just pursue life as if it's as good for me to go left as it is for me to go right. No, that's not really what I'm saying. If there are ways to discern whether left is better than right, then find out. But at the same time, so we have to allow that little gap to be in there to say, but the certainty isn't always forthcoming. So how do we deal with that? And I suppose the answer there is learn not to worry about it. Learn to accept uncertainty, yet pursue with conviction anyway. And that takes courage. I think that's why courage is a virtue. Because we have to have courage in the face of what we don't know is going to happen. And therefore what could go wrong, basically. We make our decisions in life, we place our bets in a certain sense without complete, full assurance, in many cases, of what's going to happen and what we're going to have to deal with. And nevertheless, and here's the ironic twist, if we therefore approach all of our situations in life with fear and tentativeness, then it actually makes life worse, right? Again, if you hesitate when the lion is chasing you, then you're more likely to get eaten. Whereas if you make that leap, whether it's to the left or to the right with confidence, and you really leap, then you're more likely to make the landing and get away and live another day and fight through life in a better way. When you enter battle, from the little I know of battle, I'm no soldier, but from what I understand, if you enter battle, and you need to aim your rifle or shoot your sword, and you hesitate when you aim that rifle, then you're far less likely to hit your shot. So that's the ironic twist in the whole thing. We don't have complete certainty, yet we need to have conviction. And the lack of conviction will actually make life harder to navigate. So we require courage in the face of that. We require enough courage to say, okay, I don't know 100%, I don't know with 100% certainty that this is the way to go. I don't know with 100% certainty that this is the choice that I need to make. But nevertheless, I'm going to make it as if it matters. And that way, I mean, even speaking from like a purely statistical point of view, probabilistic, then in that way, we actually increase our overall chances of living life in the way that we should. Again, it's not certain, but that's the game we need to play. I think God has been good enough in his wisdom to place some anchors. He hasn't made it such that we're only rolling the dice, you know. There really are objective measures of approaching truth and getting further away from it. But the difference between approaching and getting away is, I was going to say, there's a difference between approaching or being able to approach the truth and grasp it with the absolute in its entirety. But God has been good enough to give us ways to approach, and I think He's given us some anchor points as well. For example, it's pretty damn certain that 2 + 2 = 4. It's damn certain that the laws of logic apply, like A equals A, and a thing must be itself, and contradictions cannot be true. They're all pretty decent anchors. I dare say he's made it clear to reason that He Himself must exist. But again, when we get into the little minutiae of life and the details, what diet should we have? What thoughts and feelings do the people in our life have? What are the people around us thinking, and what do they care about? What do they believe? How does that affect me? What job should I have? What food should I eat? What places should I go to? Yeah. How do I solve this problem that's just come in front of me right now? How do I fix this tap? How do I help this person when they're down? These are all things that we don't know. We often can't we don't even have the option of becoming certain about. Yet we have to pursue them in a forthright manner. And I think it's a question of maturity. Because the rules for all of those situations isn't completely set in stone, and we're not just handed a rule book on how to approach them. It's a question of maturity because it's a question of responsibility. Each person is responsible for making that decision themselves. Each person is responsible for deciding in their own lives, how much certainty do I need in order to make the right decision and in order to live with conviction? And that's for each one of us to figure out for our own situation and in our own life. But for sure, that question is there. I think that'll be all. God bless you. Thank you very much for your time. Find me on multiple places, such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Find my YouTube channel. I'm TVC. Thank you for your time.